This is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague, Sydney Derrick, our librarian. Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm your host, Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the Society. We have officially celebrated the 250th birthday of the United States, and I hope it was an inspiring time for you. I loved looking back on the moments our country was being founded because it reminds us of what we can learn from the events surrounding the Revolution. And speaking of history being reflected in today's world, brings us to this month's episode topic. We will be discussing a debate that happened in the Continental Congress in July of 1779 over how this new nation should celebrate its birthday. And some of the traditions they came up with were ones that many of us just participated in. But not everyone was for all the fanfare. The sources for this episode are the Henry Lawrence Papers, housed in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, The Papers of Henry Lawrence, a published volume edited by Philip M. Hamer et al., an article, William Henry Drayton, The Making of a Conservative Revolutionary, by J. Russell Snapp, published in the Journal of Southern History, Volume 57, Number 4, several issues of the South Carolina Gazette, a book, William Henry Drayton, South Carolina Revolutionary Patriot, by Keith Krasinski, a book, Letters of Delegates to Congress, 1774 to 1789, Volume 13, edited by Paul H. Smith, and The Papers of the Continental Congress, a manuscript collection held by the National Archives, accessed online via Fold 3. If you're describing a typical 4th of July celebration to someone, you're probably going to talk about spending the day outside or on the water, food on the grill, drinks in a cooler, and big noises booming throughout the night with bright lights and spectacles of explosives. And almost from the very beginning, fireworks and celebratory meals were the way that some American leaders wanted to mark the day. One of those in favor was South Carolina delegate to the Continental Congress, William Henry Drayton. But if fellow South Carolina delegate Henry Lawrence had had his way, it would have been a much more somber occasion. On July 2nd, 1779, the Continental Congress was in session in Philadelphia, and one of the topics up for discussion was how to celebrate the upcoming anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The new nation was still at war at this point, but they felt it important to commemorate the occasion. This is where Jean Loget, a Frenchman who referred to himself as a fireworker, comes in. He first wrote to Congress in August of 1776, offering his services, what he called, quote, the art of artificial fireworks, as a way to create signals and lights for the military, something he said that many nations in Europe viewed as an important part of the art of war. His request was passed along to the Board of War, and I don't know if they ever officially employed him. I couldn't find any records of that. But he did at least demonstrate his skills for members of Congress because almost 3 years later, on July 1st, 1779, he writes again offering his services as a way to celebrate the 4th of July. And he mentions prior showings to the men in Congress. He says, quote, presuming with some degree of confidence that it would be agreeable to the Honorable Congress, before whom I have had the honor of exhibiting fireworks on the like occasions, I have got ready a large collection of various sorts significantly designed for part of the celebration of the approaching anniversary of our freedom and independence, end quote. In his request, he makes the argument that commemorating important events is a time-honored custom across the world and a way to help them live on for generations. Of the Declaration of Independence specifically, he writes, quote, "That great and remarkable era, the auspicious harbinger of America, first ushered in the pleasing prospect of securing happiness to our latest posterity, and ought ever to be acknowledged with gratitude as a celestial blessing and annually celebrated with effusive joy by the inhabitants of the United States to the end of time." End quote. So it's this argument that important events are worth celebrating in a joyful way that William Henry Drayton, one of the two delegates from South Carolina, will use when the proposal is debated in the Continental Congress the next day, July 2nd, 1779. According to the account of the debate that is held in the Henry Lawrence papers in our archives, it was Drayton who began the discussion of the proposal with the governing body. In his speech to Congress, Drayton mentioned that many great nations of the past had celebrated with festivity, including Greece, which had instituted the Olympic Games. He felt that a fireworks display would be an appropriate amount of festivity for his new nation. Henry Lawrence, the other delegate from South Carolina to the Congress, disagreed, and the fireworks inside the congressional session began. Now, this debate was not the first time that these two men had clashed. The South Carolinians had been serving together in Congress for just over a year by that point. But after just a few months in office, Drayton was writing to Lawrence that he had heard through colleagues that Lawrence was speaking poorly of him. There were several conflicts that served to sow discord between the men, and three of the more memorable ones were over their secretary, Moses Young, the Dean-Lee conflict that divided much of Congress, and the question of Americans' rights to the fisheries of Newfoundland, a topic that was important to a possible 1779 settlement with Great Britain. In all of these, Drayton and Lawrence fell on opposite sides. Their problems really began before the two even served together. Many years before the Declaration of Independence, Drayton had been against the idea of separating from Great Britain. He was educated there, attending college at Oxford, and once he returned to South Carolina, he was elected as a member of the Commons House. He opposed the non-importation agreement that was read under the Liberty Tree in Charleston in 1769, which stated in part that people would purchase goods made in America, especially in South Carolina, and not buy goods from merchants who refused to sign the agreement not to import from Great Britain. This was implemented in order to not pay taxes on British goods. Now, Drayton wrote several letters that were printed in the South Carolina Gazette opposing the agreement, and he did indeed refuse to sign it and suffered a boycott on his crops because of that refusal. In 1770, he returned to England but was later appointed to the Council of South Carolina, which was a royal governing body, so he returned home in 1772. Now, it was during these years that his allegiance began to shift to the side of American independence to the point where he would ultimately serve in its early governing body. But the fact that Drayton had not supported it from the beginning was a sticking point for Henry Lawrence, and part of the reason for his dislike of his colleague when they served together later in the Continental Congress. Their politics also divided the two men right away. Henry Lawrence was more in favor of a government which considers the will of the common people, and he was cautious in action with an attitude that reflected a moral center and very somber point of view. Drayton was younger and more radical in his actions, with more formal education and more elitist in his ideas in governing. He also approached life and celebrations, as we'll soon see, with more ostentation. Once they began to serve in the Continental Congress together, one of their first conflicts was a petty one over the use of the secretary named Moses Young, who served the President of Congress, which, by the way, was Henry Lawrence, and the South Carolina delegation in general. So Lawrence accused Drayton of occupying too much of Young's time and forbade him from making any more requests of Young. So in response, Drayton wrote official letters to the people of South Carolina from their congressional delegation, but those letters did not have Lawrence's signature on them or input at all. So Drayton was basically controlling the narrative to the people of South Carolina. And this was the way that their relationship continued for most of their careers together, always at odds. When a conflict arose between Silas Deane, a delegate from Connecticut, and Arthur Lee, a diplomat from Virginia, nearly every member of Congress took sides. Both were sent as ambassadors to France, along with Benjamin Franklin, and while there, Lee accused Deane of using his connections in France to further his personal business interests. As with most issues they debated, Laurens and Drayton landed on opposite sides of this issue, with Drayton supporting Deane and Laurens supporting Lee. Deane was recalled to the United States, so he was brought back, while Congress tried to work out who was telling the truth about what happened, though they never questioned Deane directly, which led him to publish his own side of the case for the public. He claimed that Lee was accusing him of wrongdoing because Lee opposed a French treaty and that Congress was denying him justice. No decision about his fate was ever really made in Congress, but the chasm between Drayton and Laurens grew deeper because of this conflict. While debate on that topic ended when Deane was later sent back to France, the arguments between Drayton and Laurens never stopped. In 1779, the issue of Americans' access to New England fisheries was also a surprisingly heated issue for the two Southern politicians. Many documents related to this debate are housed in the Henry Laurens papers in our archives. The issue placed access to the Mississippi River and fisheries in Newfoundland on the table in a potential peace negotiation with Great Britain. While Laurens sided with the New England merchants that access to the fisheries of Newfoundland was vitally important, most Southern representatives thought the Mississippi River was the more important waterway, and they were willing to give up Newfoundland rights for peace. Drayton, however, didn't think access to either should hold up an end to the fight with the British. This was, after all, a time when the threat to South Carolina of a British invasion was very real, and for Drayton, he wanted to avoid that. And side note, the British actually would invade Charleston the next year with the siege of 1780. Now, other Southern states were so angered by Laurens siding with the New Englanders that the North Carolina delegates wrote to say they couldn't guarantee troop support if South Carolina was invaded. They also threatened to send a letter to their governor requesting that he withdraw the North Carolina troops that were already located in their neighboring state. In response, Drayton pledged support to North Carolina, essentially apologizing for Laurens' stance and begged them to not request withdrawal. Now, they did not, but Laurens' anger at his colleague would also not be withdrawn. In a letter to Drayton about the drama with the North Carolina delegates, Laurens expresses his anger at Drayton's actions, writing, quote, "Did you not feel for the breach of plighted faith and honor to keep secret deliberations upon a point, the disclosure of which may dash our infant independence against the stones? Or did you think me blind? Think, speak, and act, sir, as you shall judge most convenient. I shall persevere in acting in all respects with propriety toward you, with diligence and fidelity in the common cause of America, and with the most inviolable attachment to the state whose particular servant I am." End quote. There was one issue where the two congressmen found themselves on the same side: the raising of a regiment of African American troops. A year prior to the fisheries debate in 1778, troop numbers in South Carolina were dwindling, and leaders began to worry if the state would be able to fend off a British invasion. Drayton and Laurens, at the suggestion of Henry's son, John Laurens, supported the creation of the African American Regiment, though for different reasons. For Laurens, it may have been ethical. He stated his opposition to slavery in a letter to John, though he did make his fortune as a merchant of enslaved people and continued to enslave people for the rest of his life. Drayton, again, just wanted the war to end. Ultimately, though, their rare accord did not help to further their cause. Congress did approve the measure and created a plan, but they allowed South Carolina and Georgia, the two states where regiments would be formed, to make the final decision, which was ultimately a no. This brings us back to one of the men's last debates in Congress, fireworks. It was perhaps one of their least consequential as well. It was just about a party, although the outcome is still seen in the way we celebrate the 4th of July today. So in 1779, Drayton and Lawrence are debating how best to recognize the day 3 years after independence from Great Britain had been declared. True to their personalities, Lawrence favored solemn observance, reflection, and prayer. Drayton, however, was in favor of a big show and some wine to go with it. Of course, at this point, the war was still very much going on, and Lawrence cited all of the communication they'd received in Congress about their own state, quote, bleeding at every vein, in his argument for a less costly and showy recognition. And it was true. America was not winning the war at this point. George Washington frequently wrote to Congress about the exhausted and ill-equipped state of the army. Lawrence also argued that the country was attempting to increase the value of their currency by spending less, and a big fireworks show did not fall into line with that plan. As Drayton suggested that many nations used festivity to commemorate special events, like the Greeks with the Olympics, Lawrence responded that the Olympics are what led to the downfall of the Greeks, and countries like Holland and Switzerland never held such celebrations of their independence. In his mind, the prudence of those countries is what made their independence successful. Drayton pointed out that the Olympics weren't a celebration of independence, but of feats of strength, quote, to make men athletic and robust. And in one of his best lines, Lawrence writes later in his notes, quote, is drinking Madeira wine from 5 to 9 o'clock, then sallying out to gaze at fireworks, and afterward returning to wine again, calculated to make men athletic and robust? Why then introduce the Olympic Games as an example for fireworks? End quote. While Lawrence's arguments were very well reasoned, Drayton won this one. Continental Congress voted 8 states to 3 in favor of the fireworks, with South Carolina's vote split because of the disagreement between Lawrence and Drayton, although they technically got both celebrations. So in 1779, July 4th fell on a Sunday, which meant the party would have to wait until July 5th. That Sunday, the day was commemorated by members of Congress at a noon church service at St. Mary's, the Roman Catholic chapel in Philadelphia. In a letter the next day, Henry Lawrence wrote, quote, I mean to dine at home today at my own expense, because I hold it an exceeding bad means of appreciating our paper money to give $8,000 to $10,000 for a dinner, and because I think my constituents are already sufficiently taxed, and also because the anniversary of American independence has been properly celebrated on the true day by decent attendance morning and evening at worship and occasional sermons. End quote. But many other members of Congress did gather on Monday, July 5th, with local leaders and French diplomats at a dinner at Philadelphia's City Tavern, followed by a fireworks display. John Fell, another congressman, writes in his diary of that day, quote, Congress adjourned at 12 o'clock to hear Mr. Brackenridge's eulogium on the heroes slain in this contest. Afterward, there was an entertainment at the City Tavern, and in the evening, curious fireworks, end quote. An article in the Pennsylvania Packet reported on the celebration, mentioning that there were 13 volleys of gunfire to accompany 13 toasts, one for each colony. The toasts included, number 1, the United States of America, by the grace of God, free and independent. Number 2, His Most Christian Majesty, the protector of the rights of mankind. Number 3, the Queen, princes, and royal family of France. Number 4, His Most Catholic Majesty and other branches of the Royal House of Bourbon. Number 5, General Washington. Number 6, the Allied arms of France and America. Number 7, the friends and patrons of liberty throughout the world. Number 8, the memory of those heroes who have nobly died in defending the rights of their country. Number 9, may the ensuing campaign give new laurels to our heroes and fresh luster to our stars. Number 10, may affection cement the union which wisdom has formed between France and America. Number 11, may the cap and staff of liberty soon crest the arms of Ireland. Number 12, may America never forget that virtue, valor, and science are the bulwarks of her independence. Number 13, peace, liberty, and happiness to all mankind. The article also reported that one of the fireworks that night ascended to an amazing height in the air and then burst, displaying 13 stars. The article ended on what was perhaps a little dig at those who thought their celebration would be too rowdy. Quote, the whole was conducted with great order and decorum. No unfortunate accidents happened, but joy and innocent festivity pervaded all ranks of people, end quote. And that's how many celebrations look today, gathering with people, eating food, perhaps a few drinks, and fireworks. You could say it's a tradition born out of conflict. Even in a young country struggling to build itself, fireworks, whether for observation or for war, meant freedom. And so the tradition continued. In fact, according to records in our archives, 33 years later, on July 4th, 1812, fireworks were shot off from Fort Mechanic in downtown Charleston to celebrate. Another celebration of independence in the midst of war with Great Britain, the War of 1812. As a side note, if you've never heard of Fort Mechanic and are wondering about it, it was actually later demolished and the Edmonston Alston House was built in its place. Unfortunately, William Henry Drayton only lasted a few months after this particular debate and celebration of independence. His last session in Congress was likely August 7th, 1779, after which he became gravely ill. In an August 31st letter, Henry Lawrence writes of being granted permission to visit the bedside of his colleague, who wept upon his arrival. Drayton asked Lawrence to write to his wife, Mrs. Drayton, and let her know the severity of his illness, and he died on September 3rd, 1779. Now, Lawrence and John Matthews, who replaced Drayton in the South Carolina delegation, were put in charge of Drayton's papers and affairs in Philadelphia. Some of those papers ended up being destroyed, reportedly because they may have contained government secrets. But you also have to wonder if it was one last jab from Lawrence at his former foe to rid the world of any negative press about himself. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, and I hope you were able to enjoy some fireworks to celebrate the 4th wherever you were. We'll see you back here next month for another dive into South Carolina history. Thanks so much for joining us.